Good morning, Mr. Mohrhoff. I'm very honored and I feel privileged to have a conversation with you because I have this kind of deep appreciation towards your work, your research, not only in quantum physics, but linked with spirituality and certainly in particular with Sri Aurobindo's philosophy. I would like to ask you just two questions if you have time to develop, and this for the well-being of our human beings fellows. The first is, would you think that quantum physics will replace religions?
I would hope that both quantum physics and religion will be replaced by spirituality as the master approach to truth. Now, of course, I'll add some points to this answer. One has to know something about quantum physics. It is a wolf in sheep's clothing. The mathematical formalism of quantum mechanics, that is to say, the formal apparatus of the theory, can be written down on a napkin. The attempts people have made to make sense out of this formalism which is there written on the napkin, the papers and books that have been written on this subject, fill entire libraries. So, this is to say, there cannot be a clear-cut answer to anything relating to quantum mechanics because there is absolutely no agreement on what quantum mechanics is trying to tell us about the nature of nature.
You mean the nature of nature? You mean the ontological
what nature is intrinsically in itself. I would say science can be a good servant, but it is a bad master. So I mentioned master guide in the approach towards truth and the search for truth. Because science in general, and quantum physics in particular, does not provide us with a conceptual framework. It does not work in a conceptual vacuum. It needs a metaphysical framework. Every science asks questions, obtains answers through experiments, and interprets the answers. Now, the questions are provided by a metaphysical framework that is not provided by science, and the interpretation is done within a metaphysical framework that is not provided by science. So there is always a master conceptual framework in which science is conducted. Now, as I said, it can be a good servant, it's never a good master, because it does not provide this overarching framework which is needed. So we can now pursue the question, what would be a good master? And whether science would be a good servant to that particular master. So let's take the materialistic worldview as the master. Then science is actually a very bad servant. Because quantum physics, one has to understand, technically is just a calculus of correlations. That is to say, we can calculate probabilities. The probabilities are assigned to the possible outcomes of measurements, and they are assigned on the basis of actual outcomes that have been obtained. So the other term for this is correlations between measurement outcomes. That's all that quantum physics gives us. The same could be said about classical physics, but classical physics allows us to invent a story that tells us what happens between measurements. Whereas quantum mechanics tells us, having obtained such and such measurement outcomes, I can calculate the probabilities of the possible outcomes that the next measurement will yield, but it just does not allow us to formulate any story about what happens between the first measurement and the next measurement. You know, if one tries, one gets preposterous stories, and of course much that one reads about quantum mechanics in the popular literature is just such preposterous stories. The problem is this. When we try to make sense of the world we experience, we use some basic explanatory concepts, categories as Kant and other philosophers would call them: substance, causality, interaction. So we can talk about objects that interact with each other, we can talk about events that are causally related, one is the cause of the other. That whole conceptual structure cannot be used to tell any coherent stories about what happens between one measurement and the next. We can't talk about persistent objects, about distinguishable objects, about events that are causally connected. And because this whole apparatus on which we depend to say anything meaningful is not available, so we just don't know what's going on. Now, usually such a profound ignorance should not be invoked as an explanation of anything. You see, often people say that this famous non-locality of quantum mechanics helps us to understand other things. You know, for example, paranormal phenomena, telecommunication, telepathy, all these kind of things. But, you know, non-locality is only something we don't understand, and how can we explain something that we want to understand in terms of something we don't understand? So that doesn't make much sense.
Just kind of abuse of analogy.
My answer to questions put these to people who put these arguments forward is that, you see, quantum mechanics doesn't even explain the phenomena that it predicts. How do you want it to explain phenomena that it does not predict? It doesn't work like that. So quantum mechanics tells us actually very little. This is why many physicists are saying, well-known physicists, that quantum mechanics is absurd, quantum mechanics makes absolutely no sense, etc., etc. That all that happens when you try to place quantum mechanics in a materialistic master framework. Now let's see what happens when we put it in a spiritual master framework. Does it make more sense in that context? Now, one major problem quantum mechanics poses is that it requires, in order to make sense at all, it requires us to distinguish between two domains. One distinguishes between the quantum domain and the classical domain, or the microscopic and the macroscopic domain, different words for these two domains. And one set of laws applies in one domain, and another set of laws applies in the other domain. And how does one now distinguish between these domains? You know, where is the boundary, you know, where we can say, oh, here we have to apply those laws, and there we have to apply these laws. You know, that was the big philosophical problem, you know, where do we draw the line? Because quantum physics itself doesn't tell us where to draw the line, and yet it needs these two domains to make sense at all. So somebody, a well-known British playwright, made this joke in a play about quantum physics, characterizing the situation that below quantum physics above classical physics, and in the middle, metaphysics. I said it makes a spiritual framework is able to make so much more sense out of quantum physics because it allows us to understand why we have to distinguish between these two domains. Because quantum physics is not really about what happens in the world. It is about how the world is manifested. So classical physics deals with what is happening in the manifested world, doesn't tell us anything about how the world is manifested. Quantum physics tells us about the process of manifestation. We can see, at least it's possible, it makes it possible to see that this world of our experience, which is directly experienced by us and which can be ordered in terms of the classical categories of interacting objects and causally connected events. That world is well described by classical physics, and it is manifested by a process that's not a process in space and time. It's not a causality that connects events in space and time. It is a process that leads to the creation of space and time, and that immediately also provides, helps us to understand that famous non-locality of quantum physics. Let me say shortly what actually is the problem with this non-locality. Quantum mechanics deals with correlations. It assigns probabilities to measurement outcomes on the basis of measurement outcomes. Now, this can be earlier measurements and later measurements performed on the same physical system, but it can also be simultaneously performed measurements on different systems. And these systems can be as far away, theoretically, there's no theoretical limit, they can be light years apart. Now, the correlation laws are such that in many situations, the measurement, the outcome obtained by a measurement here, allows us to make definite predictions about the outcome that will be obtained by a measurement performed at a far distance, And so we now try to understand how is it possible that this measurement has an influence on that measurement. We could understand it in terms of what is called a common cause explanation. That is to say, both, for example, there are two particles that break apart, or one particle that breaks into two parts, that dissociates, and one goes here and one goes there. And then the outcome that is obtained by the measurement here and the one that is obtained over there could be correlated because there is a common origin. So properties have been carried from here to there and from here to there. And so one could say the correlation that we now observe has its origin in how these two particles started out from the same place. Now, if they start out from the same place and then we have a correlation, that will be a local correlation because there is a local connection between the origin and the path of one particle there to the other particle there. We can draw lines in space-time. But that explanation is simply not possible. There are many, many theorems in quantum mechanics, starting from the famous theorem by John Bell in '64, that it is not possible, it is not consistent with any kind of common cause explanation to understand how these different measurement outcomes can be correlated. Now, the other alternative is then to think that what the outcome obtained here has an instantaneous, direct influence on the outcome obtained there. But that completely clashes with the second cornerstone of contemporary physics. If one is quantum physics, the other is the theory of relativity. And these are two beautiful theories, and they merge into an even more beautiful theory, which is relativistic quantum physics. And there seems to be a conflict, but the conflict is simply that our ordinary concepts, in terms of which we try to understand what's happening, they just do not apply, So I came back, I introduced this subject right now about non-locality. In the context of this process of manifestation, quantum mechanics tells us about the manifestation of the world that we experience. And this manifestation begins with a single, undifferentiated being. And the process of manifestation is a stepwise differentiation, and where we go from a transition from this original unity of everything to the multiplicity of the manifested world. And particles, subatomic particles, atoms, molecules are stages in that process of manifestation. They are not constituents of the actual world. Our attempt to explain things in terms of component parts and how they are put together and how they are relating to each other, that doesn't work, that kind of explanation. These concepts, these structures we call subatomic particles, atoms, molecules, are stages in a process that goes from complete unity to the multiplicity of the manifested world. And so these correlations between measurement outcomes, which Einstein used to refer to as spooky actions at a distance, and he could never, as the classical physicists par excellence, he could never reconcile himself to these spooky actions at a distance. But we can understand these spooky actions at a distance if we are not looking for the common cause in an earlier event, like the two particles that dissociated and moved away from each other. But we can look for the common cause in the origin of the manifested world, in that which creates space and time and creates the events that are happening in space and time. The correlation is already there before these events are actually taking place in the manifested world. So the link is not through causal connections in space and time, but through something that exists in an anterior relationship to space and time and to what happens in space and time.
May I venture a question here? Very interesting.
Please.
Would you say that all the manifested world manifests itself according to a set of rules?
Yes.
From the beginning. Yes. And what you call substance causality has really a philosophical or theosophical meaning in the context. It is more than quantum physics, because it goes beyond the border of the physics. What do you think about this? There is a meeting of something. Perhaps it is not metaphysics, but it is a little bit more.
No, it is everything. There is nothing. Whenever you talk about the physical world and anything concerning the physical world, you are doing metaphysics. Because physics is quite simply not up to the task.
Okay.
It just provides a mathematical formalism, but you have to know how this formalism relates to the physical world.
Which is really
and that is a metaphysical problem.
Very reconforting to hear it from a physicist.
Yeah. Well, I'm certainly not your run-of-the-mill physicist. You see, my endeavor often goes towards disabusing the public from the superstition. It's a pure superstition that science in general and physics in particular has some kind of privileged access to truth. You know. It's a superstition which scientists, of course, are happy to. You know, it's interesting because scientists want to abuse us of every kind of superstition, but not of that particular superstition.
Be careful.
Oh, I don't mind, you know.
Bravo. We need daring mind to lead human consciousness towards a step forward. Otherwise, we are playing round, and it's just a roundabout. So really, please develop this idea that quantum physics can do much good to the field of knowledge, but it is not another master who will abuse human mind in the field of consciousness in its evolution.
Now, because quantum mechanics is really so mysterious and presents us with so many conceptual challenges, there unfortunately has been, you know, in the history of quantum mechanics, there has been quite at the beginning a very profound understanding of the philosophical and epistemological situation, and that was due to Niels Bohr. And in those days, everybody respected Niels Bohr and found that he has really solved some very important metaphysical problems that quantum physics raises, you know. But that was a period in history which is long past. You know, today nobody understands Bohr anymore. Today everybody follows basically the formulation of quantum mechanics, which is very different from Bohr's. You see, there are different formulations of the theory, which are equivalent in the sense that they make exactly the same predictions. That is to say, we cannot test whether one formulation is right and another is wrong, because they all make the same predictions. But conceptually, the one that is basically the framework used in every textbook of quantum mechanics today, if I may say so, with the exception of my own textbook, this is a conceptual framework due to John von Neumann, and whereas Bohr described what happened between one measurement and the next, you know, is a phenomenon that cannot be divided in any way. It's completely holistic. We can't cut it up into components of any kind, whether it be component objects or component events or different steps in a continuous process. Also, no division is possible. But von Neumann introduced a division. He introduced a story about what happens between one measurement and the next, and it goes like this, that you have a quantum state. It's really just a probability calculus that helps us to, or an algorithm that helps us to calculate probabilities for the possible outcomes of the next measurement. But he takes it as the description of something that's actually going on between one measurement and the next, and he says this is a continuous process, but then at the next measurement something discontinuous happens. We have a collapse, the famous reduction of the state vector or collapse of the wave function, you know. So many terms for that, and you hear about it all the time, especially in the popular literature. But it is the framework that is used in virtually all textbooks of quantum mechanics. And I think this invention by von Neumann is the worst thing that would have happened to physics in the last century. Because that completely misleads us. It's the wrong story to be told. And it raises pseudo-questions. The pseudo-questions being, what is now causing the collapse? If that continuous, technically unitary evolution of the quantum state between one measurement and the next if that's kind of what normally happens, why this kind of supernormal event of a collapse of the quantum state whenever a measurement is made? So it's a pseudo problem invented by von Neumann by his trying to squeeze a story between what in the gap between measurements, you know. But now there is a whole industry that has sprung up of people trying to explain what causes this collapse, which doesn't really happen, but you know, okay, but people assume it is there and it needs to be explained. Now, von Neumann himself suggested or believed himself that that collapse, you know, can only happen in the mind of an observer. That the classical world with definite properties exist only in the mind of the observer, and so therefore when a quantum state kind of propagates outward from the quantum system, when then that state somehow influences, even the term influence is really not legitimate in this context, but there's a lot of illegitimate conceptualization taking place in all that, which creates a real hodgepodge, a conceptual hodgepodge. Anyway, so he suggested then it is the mind of the observer that causes this collapse. Now, according to me, that's complete nonsense, but unfortunately, the New Age audience is sold on that particular idea and believes that that is how quantum mechanics supports a spiritual worldview, because we need consciousness to make sense of quantum mechanics, because we need to explain the collapse of the wave function.
It is scientific.
It is an explanation
process
of something that doesn't exist and that doesn't happen, so it's perfectly gratuitous.
Would you link this with this, what they call principle of entropy? And
anthroposophic principle.
Anthropic
Sorry.
principle. Yeah,
yes.
Anthropic principle.
That is a different
It is
and
different.
very in itself intrinsically very interesting issue, because quantum mechanics placed in the proper spiritual philosophical framework can make us understand so many things that we cannot understand if we do not in the first place adopt that framework. You mentioned Sri Aurobindo, my relation.
Next question. My next question is how is it influenced? Has it influenced your research?
Very much, and one example is that if you take Sri Aurobindo's philosophy as the master framework, then Sri Aurobindo has a story about the manifestation of the world. And you know, perhaps as a personal recollection is that I could say a few words about how I came to study physics.
Yes,
you know?
yes, please.
Because I was as a teenager, I was always in high school, I was very interested in physics, and I wanted to become a physicist. But then somehow I got also interested very much in Indian spiritual philosophy and those yoga, Buddhism, all kinds of things. And then I ended up, it's a long story made very short, I ended up in the Sri Aurobindo ashram in Pondicherry, studying reading Sri Aurobindo's books, studying his philosophy. And then with some astonishment I observed, because you see, previously I had known Buddhist philosophy and other Indian Vedantic philosophizing, where there was not much importance attached to the physical world, you know, the goal was always, you know, get out of it. And here I see in Sri Aurobindo's writing the immense importance he attaches to the physical world. There are other worlds, superphysical worlds, subtle worlds, but he says the physical world is the most important and the greatest of all. And he talks about the manifestation of the physical world. The process, he calls it involution, because the characteristic of the physical world compared to other worlds is precisely that it is an evolving world, an evolutionary world. And there he says it has been manifested by a process of involution. He says evolution presupposes involution. Evolution is essentially an emergence of the powers of the spirit. You can say the proper process of manifestation goes through stages where an infinite quality and delight throws itself out through the formation of creative ideas and with the help of an executive force to create finite forms in movements, what we see on the physical stage, on the physical plane. And so in this process, mind is a step. It is the tool by which ideas are formed. Life is a step. It is the executive force by which ideas are realized as material physical forms. So we have the principles, the original creative principle which is above mind. Sri Aurobindo refers to it as supermind.
Supermind.
Can also use Sanskrit terms for it. That sounds a little more educated. Then there is mind, it's Vijnana and
yes.
Primarily also Pragnana. These are different aspects of the supramental working. Then mind is actually a tool of the supermind that causes divisions, that sets things apart from each other, because you can't have a world if you can't make distinctions between one thing and another. No? So it has many aspects, but then life is the force that executes, and matter with all its forms, finite forms, is the result. Now, involution means that supermind gets involved in mind, it's no longer in evidence. Mind gets involved in the functioning of the life force, it's no longer in evidence. Life force gets involved in material forms, is no longer in evidence. Evolution is the reverse process. So the last to get involved is the first to evolve. Life evolves, then mind evolves, and looking forwards towards the future, there is going to be an evolution of the supramental consciousness with a completely new species beyond the human, which will be conscious in a supramental way. You know?
Yes.
So now back to physics.
No, you can continue with philosophy.
But physics is part of philosophy, otherwise it's just mathematics.
Yes, absolutely, and very dry. But I would like to make the remark here. It is really very impressive to see that in the general frame, which is exactly what Theosophy teaches. We replace just technical terms. It is exactly that.
Sure. So, now we can ask ourselves if we want to, you see, somehow the spirit, the ultimate reality, whatever we want to name it, you can choose any name you like. There's
the being slightly different, but at our level we can accept it.
We can God, the divine, whatever. There is an ultimate reality. There's a beautiful abbreviation. If you are Ur, and the German meaning of Ur means origin. So ultimate reality, abbreviated Ur, meaning origin. That is okay. That is what is pulling the strings here, everywhere. So, if this wants to play Houdini, that is to say, imprison itself, lock itself up as much as divinely possible, and then wants to manifest itself again, go through this cycle of involution and evolution, it needs to set a stage where all the powers of the spirit are hidden as much as it's divinely possible, and then provide the stage for the adventure of evolution. Now this stage has to be governed by certain laws, and that is what I have shown in my textbook and in a number of papers. I have derived the laws of quantum physics from this assumption that they must serve as a stage on which the adventure of evolution can take place. And if I'm asking one question leading to another, if I go through the process, beginning with the question, what have the laws of that govern this stage, the behavior of this stage, they have to be like, so as to make this adventure of evolution possible. I come exactly to the laws of quantum physics. These are the very laws that you need to set the stage for this adventure of the spirit. And an important addition to this is quantum physics therefore governs the stage on which the drama of evolution takes place, but it does not govern the drama that is taking place on that stage.
Still,
it has a very small part in the whole.
Absolutely. I have the really some feeling that there is a direct link with this 13th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, the field, the knower of the field, and that which knows both the field and the knower of the field. And as quantum physics is the top of scientific understanding of the world, still it is there. It pertains to the knowledge of the field and not yet the knowledge of the knower of the field. What do you think?
And it is not also the knowledge of the field because that isn't there without the knower of the field.
I have been more generally.
I would also mention, as you bring up this passage from the Bhagavad Gita, that raises an issue that was actually yesterday touched upon. Who knows both the knower of the field and the field? Who knows that there is? Now, this is a paradox for the mind. The paradox is solved by Sri Aurobindo in that he says, well, there is a consciousness beyond the mind, which is the supermind. And there is no longer any difference between the knower and the field and the knower of the field. There's all as one.
Krishnamurti named it intelligence. So
it's just a matter of words.
A matter of words.
The main thing is the idea. Difficulties we have when we come from different traditions in understanding each other is just that we have a problem with the terminology. But sometimes there's a big problem with the language also that we have to rely on, because it's much easier to say many things in English where you can make a clear distinction between the mind and the spirit. And in French it's difficult. L'esprit et quoi? What's the other thing? Esprit stands for mind. But consciousness is again a little bit of a different concept. And in Germany we have that exactly the same difference, Geist. Geist is both spirit and mind, but how does one properly distinguish?
All right. Would you like to add something about Aurobindo's philosophy?
I have already outlined a little bit about his philosophy of involution and evolution, which is using or incorporating the Vedantic philosophy of Satchit Ananda, describing the ultimate reality. It is something that is in itself, of course, it cannot be described. We have concepts belong to the manifestation, the unmanifest, the origin of the manifestation cannot be caught in any conceptual web. So according to the Vedantic philosophy, which Sri Aurobindo bases himself on, we have three relations that allow us to describe this ultimate reality, not as it is in itself, but as it relates to the manifested world. So it is at once the consciousness that contains it, the substance, the one substance that constitutes it, and most importantly, an infinite quality or an infinite bliss. This exists in an anterior relationship to our distinction between subject and object.
So if we want to use a subjective language, we say it's an infinite bliss. We want to use an objective language, we say it's an infinite quality. But the point is that this is what is manifesting itself in the world. That is to say, it's throwing itself out into forms in order to reveal, to manifest, or experience its inherent infinite quality or joy. That's the core of Aurobindo philosophy, and the rest, what significantly added to the traditional Vedantic framework is this theory of involution and evolution as giving meaning to our physical existence. And maybe I add one thing: why would an infinite consciousness want to subject itself to imprison itself like a Houdini, losing its powers, its infinite freedom, its infinite knowledge, its infinite power? Well, ask yourself, you are an infinite consciousness. You can never be surprised. You can never overcome an obstacle. You can never make a discovery. And you see, all these things, they give us so much joy, a surprise, a discovery, a winning a victory, overcoming an obstacle. They give us great joy, these things. And if the Spirit wants to have this particular kind of joy, well, that's precisely why the Spirit has created this world, evolved himself, and now can experience this wonder of discovering, recovering itself and its powers against obstacles. Grave obstacles, because the Spirit doesn't make any half measures. Suffering is real suffering, behind which always stands the infinite bliss of the Spirit. But at the back, we are not cheating, we are really suffering, and yet it is the infinite bliss that is suffering.
That I would call faith. Absolute trust in life. Because
nothing in the world works without faith. You can't even sit down on a chair if you don't have the faith that it will not break down.
I fully agree, but it is now the occasion to clarify this notion of faith, and you said it quite sufficiently. Faith is not related to any particular religion. Faith is an essential element for spirituality.
In fact,
out of all the...
Isn't there, not very sure about the origin, but isn't it in the Bhagavad Gita itself, where it says, faith is the man, in the sense that the essence of a person is his or her faith, and what he has or she has the faith to realize, he or she will realize. Come this life, come next life, we are not in a hurry.
Sure, because it is very, very logical and consistent. The man who has faith completely adheres in himself to his own origin, meaning there is no rejection, meaning that there is no contradiction in himself. And the one who rejects, there's always a conflict, kind of opposition between him as the personality and the causality, which is in fact himself.
Of course, because we are in an evolutionary world, in an evolutionary process, there is for us the need to reject in ourselves things that properly belong to the past, to make room for things that belong to the future.
This is really the great joy of the play.
Exactly.
To be conscious of everything, to play it with fairness, integrity, just enjoy the play. Would you say, would you agree to this?
You said it.
Sorry to say it before you. Thank you so much for this privilege of having you with us as a guest speaker at the 37th European Congress, to have you to have two main lectures, which I am fully trusting that you lead the consciousness of the human mind to go further, another step. And this step is spirituality. There is no other way to go. Thank you, Mr. Mohrhoff, for
Thank
your
you.